Hey guys, what is up? Swim here. We're back for another episode of Meta Mondays. This time we've outdone ourselves. Even though it's Meta Mondays and even though the last two have been done on Tuesday, we're evolving. We're going the next mile. This is it. Nobody else is doing this in the industry. We're pushing it to a Meta Wednesday. This is a new first. We're 2 days late to this review. Okay, so let me explain real quick how this is working out. There's unfortunate delays in the system. All right, I have I could have rush jobbed it, but I wanted to make sure the data was in, and I waited an extra 2 days so that we would have all the stats so that I could provide the most accurate meta tier list possible. Hopefully this is the last time we're gonna actually end up with a delay to this degree, but if we do, we're gonna need to eventually rename it. Because I was thinking, I had this all planned in my head. I was like, okay, it's Meta Mondays, it's gonna be a day late, so I'll do a joke where I call it Tier List Tuesdays instead. And now the joke is fucking ruined because it's on a Wednesday, and I can't think of anything that starts with W for on a Wednesday. It just weekly meta report Wednesdays. There it is. That's the new name of the series, okay? Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get into this. We've got a lot of new stuff to show off, so I'm gonna go ahead and basically break down how the tier list is looking, what's up, what's good, what's down, what's bad, and what's generally good for different purposes this week. Okay, because a decent amount has changed in the past 9.5 days since I've done one of these. So we have, of course, the stats that we're going to be showing later on, that are going to be, Mobalytics data for all Masters players, and that's a large part of where these tiers are derived, although it also comes from talking to many other top players. And I'm going to mention, real quick, that this is a tier list. For the most part, this is going to be a general purpose explanation about what is going to be performing well overall at a high level. Now, I say high level, this is not at a top level, and there's a difference between those two things. If this was high performing at a top level, this would be basically the top 30 or top 50 players, and we would all effectively be saying, okay, so-and-so deck is good. For example, control decks would be overrepresented. But because this is a high-level tier list and not a top-level tier list, we're going to see some patterns. For example, there isn't any control deck in tier 1. And the reason for that is just because they tend to be harder to play. And you'll see those reflected in the Mobalytics stats win rates as well. Which is to say, I personally think decks like Ezreal and decks like Lux Control are very powerful. And Spooky Karma as well. I think these are all very powerful decks, but are very difficult to play. So I ended up putting them at tier 2 on the tier list because for almost everyone, they're going to have tier 2 win rates when they play these decks. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and get into this. We're going to show off we're going to show off all the tier 1 decks, and I'm going to talk about some of the tier 2 decks. Not all of them, but I'm going to show off some of them that are feeling a little bit worse or better, and why they're feeling worse or better, as the meta shifts. Then we're going to go into, basically the stats pages, just brush over those, and then, talk about what we might expect next week if we have any, guesses as to where things are going to go. So, starting from the top, we can get into Rekindler Garen. This is a very, very powerful concept by BBG, and effectively, this is going to be, the #1 deck that I would recommend right now. I'm going to point out that not only is this tier list organized by tier, but in general, rough kind of power scheme. So it being at the top does mean I do think it's probably the best deck to be playing broadly right now. I mean, it's very important to understand, if I have to pick a best deck, Rekindler Garen's going to be there. This is a very, very good deck. And it's extremely meta-stable, right? It is a mid-range deck, which right now is kind of the only way to be the best deck in the game. You have to be a mid-range because they're the most meta-stable. Now, of course, you can get a higher win rate with a control deck, but it's going to be much less prevalent on, ladder, and you can't really play as much of it if there's a lot of other people on ladder playing that kind of thing, right? So, Rekindler Garen is going to do very well. Effectively, it's another, Shadow Isles plus Demacia concept, as we've seen in the past. There have been, basically, every week that Runeterra has been out, there's, a new Shadow Isles plus Demacia concept. It's first it was Dawn Spiders, and then it was, I mean, God, there were actually several of them before we got to like the Fearsome Rally as well. And you can run it with Shadow Isles Allegiance and go almost full Shadow Isles. You can run it with Demacia Allegiance, go almost full Demacia, right? Which is what this deck is doing. But Shadow Isles and Demacia being the two strongest colors in the game, you're gonna be able to mix them up in a lot of different ways. So this is kind of like the way to play it this week, and it's proving very powerful. Rekindler, of course, being a card that most people agree right now at this point in time is in need of some kind of nerf. So that's going to be a card that I think is a good candidate for getting touched down a little bit. Then we've got Kinko Elusives. Previously, this was, I think, the deck that I recommended last week as like one of the strongest decks to climb ladder with, and it's been a bit dethroned by the Rekindler Garen. Now this is still a very powerful deck. It's still standing strong in terms of its win rate, but it has fallen out of favor a little bit. It's dropped a couple of points there, and you're gonna be seeing a little bit less of it on ladder than last week to, you know, a lot of people's enjoyment, because a lot of people are kind of sick and tired of that deck. Okay, Spider Aggro. So Spider Aggro, you know, there's a lot going on here. This is a deck that has been pretty prevalent for a long period of time, and last week I was fairly reluctant to add this into Tier 1. I'm still a little hesitant on this. It's a very, very, very strange concept, which is basically the idea of aggro being Tier 1. I've talked with a lot of other top players, and most people do agree, like, pretty across the board that Spiders does not necessarily like have a lot of qualities of like high Tier 1 decks in many ways. Like it gets a little bit too countered by not only, you know, opponents like fast stabilization. I think this deck mostly wins against a lot of people that don't really know how to play against aggro properly, as well as it does capitalize on like very niche meta states where there's not a lot of midrange in the meta right now. So this deck is currently Tier 1. I think it's very possible that in a few days I'll bump it back down to high Tier 2. We will see. I don't think that aggro is going to be like a largely meta stable deck, but it has a very, very high Masters win rate, and it's held it for 2 weeks now, so I am going to put it in Tier 1 at this point of time. I think I might be bumping it back down to 2, but we will see. And this is also a deck that there's a lot of other ways to play. I brought to a tournament a version of Spider Aggro that was running Phantom Prankster, and I think that's going to be a powerful direction for the deck to move into, but I need to experiment more with that before I can, you know, openly recommend the concept. And then Ephemeral Midrange. This is a very, very powerful deck that I was thinking would probably be a bit better than it was, but I think this still does outclass like the fearsome decks in general right now. It's a little bit less consistent than them, and you know, the opponent has some more counterplay opportunities, but I think most of the skill in this deck is it's harder to play than the fearsome decks for sure. And you need to know when to take risks, right? Mostly, it seems like a very straightforward deck. You've got a ton of like interesting combos with like Islander into Keeper, Darkwater Scourge with Deathmark. You can use Hecarim with Dawn of Dusk. You can use Islander with Hecarim with Rekindler. You know, there's tons of different paths this deck can take. Sometimes you go for a combo with like Duo, Mark of the Isles, Dawn of Dusk. It's a tricky deck to play because you need to know what combo to go for at what time, but it's very rewarding, and I don't think it's like so incredibly hard that it's going to be like, you know, bumped down on the tier list because of that. It is standing strong at one of the higher win rates right now. Okay, so it is right now above Fearsome Rally. Fearsome Rally is going to get bumped down to the top of Tier 2. And the reason for that is mostly because of these two other decks that are kind of doing the same things in different ways. And those are going to be Rekindler Garen, that's kind of like stealing the spotlight of being a Demacia Shadow Isles mid-range deck. It's going to be stealing all the good matchup tables from Fearsome Rally, as well as like the Ephemeral Midrange, which uses much of the same cards to, you know, I would say a slightly better effect at this point in time right now. At the end of the day, the Fearsome Rally deck was one that I think was getting a ton of surprise value early on. As people realized more and more that, like, as long as you predict that the deck is going to be running like Relentless Pursuit in their hand, it's like it's a very readable card, and if you're ready for Relentless Pursuit, it's still going to be strong, but it's not going to be like an auto win the game button anymore. And the same is true for stuff like Radiant Guardian, which is going to like pretty much always be very heavily telegraphed when you're thinking about playing it. The deck does end up getting bumped down. Now it's still a very powerful deck, and it's still a very meta-stable deck, but we're going to put it in Tier 2 for now. Friendly reminder, I'm always going to do it at this point of the video. Tier 2 is not, you know, derogatory. It's not like a bad deck. In fact, tier 2 decks at most are going to be a couple win percentage points lower on their win rate. Sometimes they're higher win rates. You know, tier ratings is definitely not necessarily a function of win rate, but Fearsome Rally is standing very strong. It's still a deck I can easily recommend. Then Ezreal. Now, if you've been watching the series, you'll know Ezreal has been up and down, just like bottom of tier 1, top of tier 2, bottom of tier 1, top of tier 2. It's very, very close between those two, but I think right now I got to give it to the top of tier 2, which it spent most of its lifetime being. It is a deck that is very stable. It is right now currently like one of the most played decks in the Masters ladder, so it's a very, very, very meta-stable list. But I think it's tricky to play it at like the highest level it wants to be played. It's not, I wouldn't say it's a hard deck to play actually. But in terms of being able to play it at its highest level, it is hard, yes. And it is going to not have as high of a win rate as some of these other decks, despite having a very, very high play rate. So that's going to be top of tier 2. And let's quickly go over some of the Karma variants. That's Heimer Karma, Spooky Karma, and kind of like Lux Control, which, honestly, this is kind of like more of a mid-range deck, if anything. Same with Heimer Karma. You can call them either Control or mid-range, but they're a bit more mid-rangey than Control, if anything. Maybe I'll change this tag here, but basically, let's just take a quick peek at these. Heimer Karma, I'm still going to easily recommend this. I think, for the most part, it's actually going to be... if you're going to play Karma, I think I would recommend this version of Karma. I think this will do the best, generally speaking. Although Spooky Karma is going to be a very, very powerful control concept, especially when you add in the Mist's Call that early versions of this deck weren't running, but it's going to definitely help this deck perform, keeps your Karma alive as long as you can plan around it. This is a powerful deck that is really hard to play. This is one of the hardest decks to play in the entire game, so I would say, you know, with... with a grain of salt, when we get to the win rate stats later, you'll see this deck doesn't have a super high win rate. But I still recommend it very heavily because, you know, if you think you can play it, it's going to do very well for you. It's just tricky to play, and it's, you know, you'll see that in its win rate. And then there's Lux Controller, Karma Lux. This is a deck that has been kind of like flavor of the week for the past like week or two. It was pretty popular in like early showings, but again, it's another tricky deck to play, and there's a lot of different variations to build it. So for that reason, I'm gonna put it like middle or low tier 2. And then finally, I'm gonna skip these last two just because they haven't really changed too much, but I'll mention Prankster Burn. Not a super powerful deck. This is a deck that I hit number 1 in A with, and I want to clarify, this was never a super powerful deck. I made sure, I think when I tweeted that I got number 1 with this list, I made sure to mention this is like probably a tier 2 deck. Don't overrate it. I think that anytime someone makes like number 1 on ladder with a deck, people will like net deck it. In reality, like most decks that make number 1 on ladder are not that good. A lot of times, the reason that decks are making number 1 on ladder is because they're getting like kind of surprise value out of something like that, and any statistical base with a sample size of 1 is going to be very, very irrelevant. So it's a solid deck. It is. It's not a bad deck, but it's not a deck that I would recommend as easily. I think it's fun, and I think it's fairly unique, but it's definitely been over net decked. I've seen this on ladder like quite a bit. It's solid, don't get me wrong. Like, you know, I'm not going to trash my own deck, but I don't know. I just see so many people net decking anything just because it gets to number 1. Whereas like even the person who got it to number 1 is very clearly saying, hey man, there's better decks. Just come on, man. It's just number 1. It's not that big of a deal. It's mostly going to be happening kind of randomly, honestly. Okay, anyway. That's the tier list as it is. Now, let's go ahead and get into the stats side of things and see where those are at. Okay, so the stats here now, this is going to be the Mobalytics data. I'm going to breeze over this. There's a lot going on here, but I'm going to be linking this in the pinned comment, so you guys will be able to see this for yourself if you want. And I'm basically just going to be covering the win rates here. So this is Masters tier games for the week of March 1st to March 8th. And so that, you know, it's going to be a couple days old, and you're going to see some results that are going to be a little hard to parse, and that's my job and the job of, you know, everyone I talk to, all the other top players, that we're going to come to the decisions for the tier ratings. I must caution you, as I always do every week, high win rate doesn't mean good deck. It's a lot more complex than that, and there's a lot going on. I'm going to give you guys a good example of that. So, For example, Spider Aggro. Spider Aggro has a very, very high win rate. That's going to be holding at 61.4. That is almost the highest win rate overall here, right? Crazy, crazy high win rate. It's the highest win rate for games played above, like, any games played above 500, right? However, there's a lot going on here. It's not a super meta stable deck, holding at like half of top games played. That's going to be like 1,800 games played. And most importantly, this happens to be a brief period of time where mid-range is kind of largely non-present from the meta, right? This was basically the period of time right after like fearsome decks were dying down, but right before the Rekindler Garen was picking up in Steam, right? Which is Rekindler Garen is going to be a lot more common, you know, these days, especially like, you know, when you add like the last few days that we're missing out. And as mid-range decks go up, Spider X win rate's going to go down, right? So there's going to be a lot of like fluctuations, you know. At the end of the day, you're dealing with a couple percentage points up, a couple percentage points down. And of course, you need to keep in mind, these are all Masters games. So if you personally are floating around the top end of Masters, you're going to be seeing results that are going to defy this. For example, maybe you're playing your Karma list that's going to be, let's say, Spooky Karma. Maybe you're playing Spooky Karma and you're like, you know, as high as 55 might be, I guess it's pretty average, I would say. What's the deal? I feel like I'm nuts with this deck. And maybe that's true. Like, at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of decks that have weaker showings. Here's Karma Lux at 51, despite a lot of people like maining this deck. It's a very powerful deck. You know, these are broad statistics, and people are going to be playing the deck different from you. And decks that are very easier to play. I'm not going to say aggro is easy to play, per se. There's a lot of difficult decisions you have to make. But at the end of the day, in terms of, like, the skill floor of the deck, it is easier, regardless of skill ceiling. The skill floor is easier to play for decks like Spider Aggro and Rekindler Garen, and that's going to be reflected by their high win rates as well. But that's also going to be somewhat reflected by the tier list, because I do want to recommend to you guys overall decks that are, as I say, easier to play. So, let's go sample size 1K up from the top. Elnux and Ezreal, it's going to be floating at 54.4% win rate, which is average to like slightly below average right now. It's a little, basically it's like a very, very stable deck. It'll do very well for you, but right now it's games played being so high is definitely like basically regressing to the kind of like 50% win rate that you expect to see. It's a solid deck, but it's not tier 1, and it's very, I would say, overplayed right now. I would actually agree with that. Like, the games played in a logical system should be lower than 3,400. Spooky Karma is solid. This is a, you know, pretty popular deck. It's holding at a pretty average win rate. 55 is just kind of like super middle of the road right now. It'll do pretty well, but, you know, it's, I think, one of the strongest decks in the game when played at a high level, for sure. It's definitely a tier 1 deck if we're talking about like top level play, like tournament level play and stuff like that. You will see this deck being run in tournaments, but its win rate here is going to reflect the latter win rate, and that's going to be average, which I think I agree with. Kinko Elusives, yep, it's got a bit of a bump down from last week's win rate. Holding pretty strong. It's still an above average win rate. It's still going to do pretty great things. Then there's Fearsome Rally. Fearsome Rally, of course, coming down a little bit. That's also going to be floating at kind of the very, very average 55% win rate. Burn Aggro is a deck that's actually holding a little bit stronger here. And here's where we see just like these aggro stats being a little inflated. I guarantee if you're tracking this last few days, and if you're looking at like top masters, there's going to be a lot more Rekindler Garen, especially in the coming days. Even after I make this video, there's going to be more and more Rekindler Garen, and because of that, aggro win rates are going to fall off, right? So we can extrapolate. Burn Aggro, it's got a decent win rate, but it will be below average. If not already, it will be below average in like 2 or 3 days' time. If not already. I think it is already, though. Spider Aggro, same thing. The big difference is Spider Aggro's starting point is a lot higher. So I am tenuously granting this tier 1 status. I personally, honestly, I have a hunch this will be tier 2. We will see. We most certainly will see. But just in terms of, you know, reading the data and talking with a lot of other top players, I'm kind of betting against myself a little bit here. I'm gonna give this one tier 1 for a couple days. and see where we're at then. Ephemeral Midrange. Of course, this one is actually maintaining pretty powerful 59% win rate. That's a good deck. I do think this is a very strong deck. It's surprisingly tricky to play. There's a lot of different combos you're going to have to play with that one, and this is a deck that I personally think very much deserves its tier 1 status. Honestly, the fact that Spider Aggro is ahead of this is just downright wrong to me, but I mean, it is my list. I'm keeping spiders up for now. We'll see. I'm not happy at myself for that decision, as you can clearly tell. Heimer Karma is doing pretty decently. Their win rate is, only a little bit above average at 55.8. But, they're holding pretty strong at a surprising amount of games played here. Karma Lux is definitely, a lot more behind. This is largely because it was a deck that was kind of like sort of made and popularized during this time, so a lot of people were still playing like inefficient versions of it. So I think it's definitely going to be having like a higher win rate than represented here, but I don't think ultimately it will be a tier 1 deck. I did have it at tier 1 for a few days on my list, and I do think that it's a very powerful list, but ultimately not tier 1, no. Rekindler Garen, as we can see, and this is like the deserved win rate for sure. This is a good deck. It's a meta-stable deck. It will counter good meta decks, and it has a hard time being countered, unlike stuff like Spider Aggro, right? So even though it has the kind of like lowest, it doesn't have the highest win rate, I would say this has the highest affected or interpreted win rate here. This is going to be a very powerful deck coming out. Prankster Burn, 51.5%, and War Mother Control, 50%. Nothing too surprising. Again, these are two decks. I think these decks are solid. They're not bad per se, but these are two decks that are kind of popular just because they reached rank 1. I got rank 1 with Prankster Burn. Alan got rank 1 with War Mother's Control, and a lot of people are just in net deck number 1 mode. There's a lot of good decks, and if you watch anyone, they'll talk about what they think good decks are, and different people will disagree, but I think there's just too many people that just net deck anything that gets to number 1. And I mean, you'll see that here. These decks are not bad, but they're definitely overrepresented on ladder. Also, there might be a bit of a statistical bias in terms of the kind of person that will just blindly net deck whatever it gets to number 1. But, that's a conversation for another time, I guess. Listen, they're not bad decks. They're solid, but they're definitely overrepresented in the ladder right now. And as you can see, their win rates are reflecting that. So that's going to be my breakdown, and of course, again, you can look through this yourself and you can go lower, but I'm just going to be talking about anything that's, bridging like 1,000+ games here. That's going to be kind of my cutoff for this week. So that's going to be the stats for this last week. All right, so that just leaves us with, where are we going from here? What decks are going to be kind of like more popular? Well, I do think that different forms of Ezreal are definitely going to be experimented with. I personally have a hunch that Shadow Isles Ezreal is the best way to run him. I mean, this Shadow Isles color, this green region is actually, it's fairly decent, honestly. It's like, just combine it with everything. You put Rekindler and everything. It's great. It's honestly, it's amazing. Yeah, it turns out that's not bad. And I've been messing around with Nox Ezreal. I messed around with Nox Ezreal. God, that was a while ago, and I ended up putting the deck down pretty fast. But recently, Hyped and Alan have been picking it up and definitely liking it more than I did. So maybe I dropped that one a little too early. Maybe Nox Ezreal has some pretty big potential. That could be good. So people are going to be messing around with different forms of Ezreal, and as soon as people decide X Ezreal is the best way to play it, it will shift the meta in a pretty major way. Like, let's say everyone playing Freljord Ezreal on ladder just all switches to Nox Ezreal. Suddenly, that deck's going to have slightly different counters, or Shadow Isles Ezreal. That's going to be a big meta shift, because there's a ton of people running Ezreal in Master's Ladder. It's a very, very good archetype right now. So that has a huge ability to shift the meta in a major way. And a lot of people are going to experiment with like different kinds of mid-range and different ways to use allegiances as well. A lot of people are saying that the meta is kind of solved at this point, and I wouldn't say solved, no. I would say that the progress is kind of like slowing down, and there's going to be like fairly few, revelations before the next expansion, but it's far from a state of being solved, for sure. There will be a lot of shifts that we will see, and a lot of interesting ways to utilize color combinations that we just haven't seen before. I do think, additionally, there's going to be a lot of experimentation with tuned Demacia lists as well. I personally think that Demacia is probably... I would say it's the strongest color in the game. Now, strong and best are kind of meaningless terms. I don't like putting things on linear power levels. I think it's nonsense. But I would say, while Shadow Isles is much more versatile, Shadow Isles is kind of good at doing everything, Demacia is great at doing one thing and one thing only, and that is just mid-range. But they are extremely powerful in terms of like all of their cards are just good mid-range cards, and they have a lot of flexible options. They do have a strong allegiance, which people are messing around with. You know, there's BBG's list, but there's also like 209's list that's like running elites in like aggro, and they're using Relentless Pursuit. That's also very good. There's a lot of ways of running Demacia, and then of course there's like Barrier Challenger as well. You know, and Barrier Challenger is... I don't think that deck was as amazing. I actually thought that deck had a lot of potential like 2 weeks ago, and it didn't really have legs. But there is some big things in Demacia that people are going to be experimenting with. That's going to be a big direction for the ladder to move forward. I mean, check out like even like Karma Lux, you know. That was not a thing until like 2 weeks, a week and a half ago or so, and then it started to gain a lot of momentum. And there's a lot of different ways to build it and optimize it. And then there's also like interesting things like Lux Control with Shadow Isles, or Lux Control with, you know, some other color. There's a lot of ways to build Demacia that just haven't been done yet. Whereas I think kind of everyone has done everything with, for example, Shadow Isles, just because that got more attention at the start. So I will say, those are my 2 meta predictions for this next week or week and a half, is that different forms of Ezreal are going to be emerging, and Demacia is going to be experimented with in a lot of different forms, and Rekindler Garen might very well get dethroned, although I will say this Rekindler card is pretty good, huh? Isn't that? Yeah, Okay. That's going to be it for me this week, guys. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this one got delayed again. Look, listen. I was terrible at like my school assignments. I would always turn in my assignments late, and I would always have the best excuses. I don't have any excuses this time around. And also, this isn't me procrastinating. This is actually the opposite. This is me wanting to make sure that, you know, the data is all there and I'm able to deliver the highest quality report for the meta that I can. I don't want to rush it out and just give you guys a half-assed product. So, you know, it seems probably like I'm just turning in my assignment late, but actually, when you think about it, it's very much the opposite. I am indeed just trying to make sure I am delivering quality over, I guess, quantity, honestly, because I mean, it's kind of the same thing as quantity. Anyway, that is it, however, for me this week, guys. So I will see you guys next Monday, okay? For sure this time. Peace out, boys.